Hello and welcome to the book launch of Ineligible. My name is Oyindamola Alaka and I am the Publicity and Promotions Manager for Fernwood Publishing. I am excited to kick off this event. Please do subscribe to Fernwood's YouTube channel to know when we have events or other exciting content. To start off, I would like to acknowledge that I am calling from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homelands of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past and present, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. As an immigrant to this land, I recognize my privilege as a settler in this land, and I dedicate myself to working in partnerships with Indigenous communities in my location. Tonight's event is brought to you by Fernwood Publishing in partnership with Novel Ideas Bookstore, the Department of Sociology, Queen's University, and the Surveillance Studies Center. You can order a copy of Ineligible at Novel Ideas Bookstore or via your local bookstore. Some housekeeping before we start. There is a live chat on your screen. Please leave any questions and comments there. There will be an opportunity towards the end for the speakers to answer any questions you have. Also note that the chat is being monitored and any racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic comments will be deleted. Next for tonight, I'd like to introduce our author, Chris Mackey. Dr. Chris Mackey is an activist scholar specializing in mixed methods community-based research in the areas of gender-based violence, women's poverty and homelessness, and welfare surveillance. Chris continues to work from their lived experience with poverty and gender-based violence. These experiences propelled them into activism and have shaped their approach to research. They currently work as the Research and Policy Manager at Women's Shelter Canada, a national network of violence against women shelters in Ottawa. For their research for Ineligible, Chris received the Canadian Sociology Association's Outstanding PhD Graduating Student Recognition Award and the Shirk Vanier Canadian Graduate Scholarship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Mackey.
Thank you, Oyinda, for all of your work helping organize this virtual event. Really appreciative of everything you've put into it. Really happy to be here today with all of you. I'd like to thank you all for joining me today. I know we're all very busy this time of year, pretty burnt out from working hard. So I really appreciate your time today to talk about the launch of my book, Ineligible: Single Mothers Under Welfare Surveillance. It's been in the making for 12 years, and it's my pleasure to be here today with Amy and Carrie Lynn to have a conversation about some of the key themes of the book. And we will reflect on our lived experiences as those who've lived on social assistance, participated in anti-poverty activism, and worked frontline delivering services. We'll also talk about some of our learnings from the activism that we did together and what the book can teach us moving forward under an Ontario Conservative government that has threatened to make some significant cuts and overhauls to social assistance prior to the onset of the global pandemic. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people located in La Pêche, Quebec. As a white settler and uninvited guest, I work to unlearn and challenge colonialism and white supremacy in the work that I do as an anti-poverty and anti-violence activist and scholar. I work in solidarity with Indigenous communities to dismantle colonialism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy that continues to shape many of the systems, including social assistance, that folks rely on to survive across Turtle Island. And thank you to the Surveillance Studies Center, the Department of Sociology at Queen's University, and of course, Novel Idea, located in Kingston, for sponsoring this event. If you haven't gotten your copy of Ineligible, head on down to Novel Idea or your local independent bookstore, or order right from Fernwood directly. And of course, I'd like to take a moment to thank all the folks who've made this book possible. I know we have limited time, and if I was to thank everyone, I probably would take up our entire hour. A book, even though it might seem like a solo effort, is truly a collective endeavor. Thank you to the folks at Fernwood who brought this book to life. And And a special thank you to Dr. Laureen Snyder, who stood by me through a pandemic to transform a 400-page dissertation into a digestible and accessible book for the masses. Also, thank you to my family and friends and my partner for their unwavering support over the years. I'm truly grateful for each and every one of you, and you are on pages of this book. And also, I'm deeply humbled and grateful for the single mothers who took the time to sit with me and share their very personal stories and intimate details about their lives, and what it's like to live in a system designed to break them, to dissuade them, and to make them ineligible. I could not be here launching this book without their powerful words and strength to speak out against injustice. So thank you to the activists near and far. Some of you are here today who continue to fight with their bodies, hearts, and souls every day to make the world a better place. So with that said, I'd like to move on, give you a little taste of the book. So I think it's really important to contextualize myself in this work a little bit, to give you a sense of who I am and how I come to this work. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to read Ineligible, I'll read a couple of pages to give you a sense of how I've approached this work. And even though this book isn't about me, I think this gives you a sense of how I've approached this research. And as a reflexive feminist activist scholar, I recognize in how I'm situated in the research that I do and how my own lived experiences shape not only the research design, but of course the end result, which in this case is an accessible book that I hope anyone can pick up and read. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to read the intro of the book to you. And yeah, hopefully I don't start crying while I read you this. It's a bit emotional today, isn't it? Okay. Poverty carries a lot of stigma and shame. Those of us who grew up poor know all too well the creative strategies and diversions we come up with to hide our struggles to fit in. Poverty and being fatherless was something that I felt shame around and spent a great deal of my energy concealing and avoiding when asked about my home life. Because I worked so hard at hiding these realities, I did not think that anyone cared about the poor, the struggle, the stigma, the trauma. I was luckier than most. My mother was loving, fun, and full of life, despite the multiple jobs she held down as a single mother raising 2 kids on her own. When we had to move across the country and leave our life behind and start over, she had few options but to go on welfare until she could get back on her feet. The harshness with which she was judged and treated, including the sting of town gossip and moral judgment, specifically because she was single, young, and receiving social assistance, was unyielding. The absence of a husband made her suspect of all kinds of immoral doings, from sleeping around to drug addiction. I knew this because my classmates would taunt me and tease me. And as a young child, this was humiliating, and I internalized this stigma. I carried the pain with me for a long time, hidden deep down, until it was pulled out of me unexpectedly in a lecture hall. I never imagined writing a book about welfare surveillance or the regulation of poor single mothers, especially because it was so close to home, an uncomfortable home from which I spent a great deal of my life distancing myself. During my undergraduate degree, I had not come across research or writings on poverty and the experiences of single mothers until my final year for a course on gender and the welfare state. When I first read Pat Capone's Dispatches from the Poverty Line, May You Rest in Power, and Margaret Little's No Car, No Radio, No Liquor Permit, I was moved so deeply that I could hardly articulate my thoughts about these readings in my seminars. I found myself having to leave class during documentaries about poverty, especially when it zeroed in on the intersections of family and state violence. In some ways, I felt exposed and raw, and yet I also felt seen and my experiences validated for the first time, as I had not seen struggles of poverty, as well as the defiant resistance from the perspectives of women and single mothers reflected in the course content until then. I was inspired by anti-poverty and feminist writers and thinkers who were committed to exposing the injustice and unearthing the everyday experiences and resistance of what it's like to be poor in a system designed to break us, including those who had actually lived it or who were embedded in anti-poverty activism. I was called to anti-poverty activism and research because I felt affinity with these women's stories, and part of me thought I could heal my own pain by confronting the injustice. A rich body of anti-poverty, feminist, social, legal, and anti-racist research had documented and challenged Ontario's neoliberal welfare reforms of the 1990s and the impacts on single mothers. Yet few had examined the multi-layered welfare surveillance apparatus and the accompanying privatization of social services. Welfare surveillance became my entry point and added a new lens and exploration on the criminalization and stigmatization of poverty in Ontario. So that's just a bit of a teaser to give you a little sense of how I'm coming to this work, and thank you for listening to that. And before we dive into the fun part of this event, which is talking to these amazing activists who are here with me today, I did want to give some context to some of the concepts we'll be talking about for folks who haven't come across them before. So based on that, from that piece I just read you, I interviewed 18 single mothers on social assistance in Kingston, Toronto, and Peterborough, Ontario, and as well as Ontario Works caseworkers and anti-poverty activists about their experiences and thoughts on welfare surveillance, as well as doing a deep dive into the regulations, policies, and directives of Ontario Works, which is its own world. So that's how I based my research on. And welfare surveillance is the main concept we're talking about today, and it's we'll note it throughout our presentation. And for folks who haven't come across it before, it relates to the technologies, practices, regulations, and implications of tracking social assistance recipients. It can be used by the state or the government to monitor and regulate low-income people, and often across multiple jurisdictions, not just social assistance. It also involves non-government actors such as communities and neighbors who might be calling welfare fraud hotlines and making reports. And of course, private companies and increasingly NGOs and employers who participate in workfare. And as I detail in the book in Chapter 1, the regulation of the poor is not new. However, the techniques and tools have changed. In Chapter 2, we'll tell you a little bit about the welfare surveillance apparatus in detail and maps out the various technological and non-technological means that Ontario Works, which we will also refer to as OW in our presentation, uses to surveil recipients. And we're talking about things like biometrics, financial surveillance, and spouse in the house policies. Recipients indeed felt like they were being watched and guilty just for being on social assistance. And this, of course, intensified depending on the intersections of their social locations. What the book really reveals is that social policy is not gender or race neutral. In fact, gender, disability, race, and ethnicity impacted how single mothers navigated the system, and as well as the different types of surveillance and discrimination they felt as a consequence of that. So now we're ready. Now that I've got all the basics out of the way here, I'm excited to dive in and open up the discussion to my wonderful co-conspirators to talk a bit more about these themes. And I've also had the pleasure of organizing with these two women in the past. And we just had a conversation before the talk started about how that was about 10 years ago. So here we are coming full circle, and I'm just so happy to be here with the two of them. And before I ask my first question to the panel, I'm going to start with the bio. So I have Amy's bio here. Amy Van Vleck is an activist whose focus has been primarily on anti-poverty, violence against women and children, anti-racism, and safe consumption. Her work was accomplished by organizing civil disobedience events and working to directly change harmful policies with policymakers. Amy served on the board of directors for Kingston Interval House, was the chair of the Kingston Coalition Against Poverty, was the president of the Kingston and Islands NDP Riding Association, and is a recipient of the Daniel Benedict Award from the Ontario Health Coalition. And Carrie Lynn Poole-Cotnam is the chair of CUPE Ontario's social service sector, representing 35,000 social service workers in the province. For 13 years, Carrie Lynn worked as a frontline caseworker with those in receipt of social assistance in the south end of Ottawa. She has been a passionate voice for women's economic justice by representing CUPE Ontario on the Ontario Equal Pay Coalition, serves as the treasurer of the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare, and has been involved in anti-poverty work for the last 10 years. So please join me in welcoming these two. And I'm just going to get us started off, if that's okay. So I'll start with you, Amy. I'm wondering, when we met back in the day organizing with KCAP, I remember we had many conversations, many late nights and rants about the challenges of doing that type of activism while also parenting, solo parenting, and dealing also with Ontario Works. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Ineligible and the consequences surveillance has on poor single mothers.
Thank you so much, Chris. First of all, I just want to congratulate you. This is amazing. As said, I kind of feel like I was around when you started this, and I always felt very comfortable with you. So I'm so excited that you invited me to be here. Reading Ineligible was like super emotional for me. The things the women were saying in there just rang true for everything I've been through. And just, moving forward, how scary it is that, nothing has changed and we still don't really have, enough people out there trying to fight to make this better. Prices of everything is getting higher. And what we'll talk about that a bit later, but just the surveillance technology coming up as well is going to be getting worse. And so I really am worried about your next book, right? Like, what are we going to talk about on your next book? Because I think it really is only going to get worse. I think you did a wonderful job at bringing to light what is really happening within the government when it comes to surveillance, and not just OW, but CAS, food banks, housing, all of it, all of the surveillance that mostly women, single moms deal with on a daily. I think I'll stick with that for now.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. And Carrie Lynn, I'm wondering what your thoughts are in reflection to what Amy just shared, and some of your thoughts on the surveillance piece and how single mothers specifically navigate that, especially coming from a frontline worker experience. What do you have to say about that?
I think it's so reflective, and especially since I've had some time between directly working with recipients of social assistance and then having some time and now reflecting on that work. Surveillance is embedded in all of the systems, and that is by design. And when we go through training as caseworkers, it is trauma informed. It is, based on rules and regulations, the 400 of them in the Ontario Works Act in particular. And the eligibility criteria is rigid. It's a Harris legacy that's still with us today. And the number of hoops that it takes for someone to qualify for social assistance, which is not adequate and is in fact a pittance, and creates an entire environment of full disclosure, and the ability to really dig in to make sure that people are eligible, is a really challenging dynamic when you're actually just trying to help people. And it creates a barrier to that helping relationship where you're all of a sudden trying to talk about, well, what about school? Maybe we can find childcare. You've said that you're interested in pursuing this, but when it's a day-to-day struggle to maintain your housing and to eat and, to really navigate what poverty looks like, having a vision and having hope of what the future could be is an impossible leap when you're not even adequately cared for. And, building a relationship based on eligibility criteria is really impossible. And it takes time, and it takes trust, and it takes small wins and support and being there in crisis moments. And by design, that's not how the system is set up. It takes a Herculean effort to be able to actually get there.
Absolutely, Carrie Lynn. Thank you for mentioning that. And that was a huge theme that I noticed speaking to the single moms. And I know, Amy, you have some thoughts on this as well, in terms of just that relationship with your caseworker is so critical. And yet the system is designed in a way that makes that relationship very difficult to actually have, especially when we're relying on algorithms and technology to spit out decisions. So, Amy, do you have some reflections on that key issue with the needing that relationship with caseworkers, but it being very difficult?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been on social assistance. I'm still on social assistance. I'm on ODSP now. But being a single mom, I kind of lucked out. Unfortunately, a lot of people who apply for social assistance, they're not always educated. They haven't worked, and that's because they come from, an environment that they've just, have never learned how. And so that stigma that comes along with it, I mean, I always kind of stuck out as, well spoken. I've had jobs. They kind of just felt like I was, just there because I was having a rough time. So I always got treated pretty well. But, when I started my activism and I started hearing the many, many stories, people coming to me, telling me the things that their workers were saying, what they were doing, I really became just disgusted at some of it. And again, it's not every worker, right? I know a lot of them go to school because they want to help people or they've been on assistance, so they want to do better. It's they can't, right? As Carrie Lynn said, it's designed to not accept people and make it difficult for them. I think a lot of times what ends up happening is, people become there's so much bureaucracy and so much red tape on a daily basis for poor people that they just become angry at everyone, right? They're tired of giving their story. They're tired of being told what to do. They're tired of jumping through hoops. So it doesn't even matter at one point if they do get a really good worker, they're angry. And it's really hard to create a good relationship with someone that way. I mean, how vulnerable would you feel having to tell, every couple of months you're getting a new worker because they switch so often, and the vulnerability you would feel having to tell your story over and over and over again and having to tell a new face, explain to a new person, basically beg why you need this money.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I think a lot of times workers go into it wanting to help, but I think at the end of the day, they do become very worn out and overwhelmed. And I think they become desensitized to people's stories. They've heard so many sob stories by that point that they just don't care anymore. I actually really liked one quote from one of the caseworkers. His name was Tom, and this was on page 131 of the book. It sounded like Tom really wanted to try to be a good worker, but he said, in quotes, "No matter what I tried to be to the clients, they would always see me as a person who controlled their money and their life, really." And I think that's what it comes down to, right? Workers are seen as, like your parents giving you your allowance, and you kind of have to explain to them why you deserve it. And I think that can become really tough. Not everybody's a Carrie Lynn. Unfortunately, not everybody listens. And so people become disgruntled. And again, it's just like they don't make the rules, unfortunately. It's what they have to do. And then it just creates this really volatile relationship between clients and recipients.
Yeah, thank you for that insight, Amy. I really appreciate it. And it was very interesting how difficult it was to actually gain access to interview caseworkers. And that really speaks to power, right? Like that really is interesting that there were a lot of hurdles. I had to go to management. Management often outright denied me access to interview caseworkers. But that's what separates this study from others as well, is that often caseworkers are not asked. And I wanted to ask them what their thoughts were. And almost all but one were hand selected by management. So imagine what kind of quotes I would have got had it been folks who willingly came to me as well. But, I think you're touching on an important issue of just like being caught in the system themselves. And also, I also talk about in the book also how they're under a form of surveillance as well to meet targets and quotas and to enforce these policies and adapt really quickly as well, and how that's leading to a lot of burnout and a lot of compassion fatigue. And then there's a range, right, in the attitudes and approaches to casework as well. You have folks who are definitely advocates like Carrie Lynn, who like will go right up to management and will advocate tooth and nail for their clients. And then there are folks who actually think it's their job to punish the poor and take some delight in that. There's not many of them, but in any workplace, there's always those folks, right? So Thank you for saying that. And it kind of leads me to my next question, which I would love Carrie Lynn to kick off for us, is just in considering the current like political climate and in terms of the Ford government. I'm wondering how things are unfolding at the provincial level in terms of service delivery. And we've had a couple of chats already about how you're seeing some changes coming down the pipeline and your concerns about it in terms of automation, surveillance, more algorithms. So I'd love if you don't mind sharing some of what you're hearing at those tables.
There is no doubt that social assistance is undergoing massive transformation, and that's not necessarily on the legislative side right now, but more to do with service delivery. And all of this can springboard off the introduction of the SAMS technology that was introduced a number of years ago now, that allows for more interfacing with different applications and automation. So the way that service used to begin is that intakes would begin in a home-based office based on your postal code. And now we have prototypes underway across the province where there's a centralized intake bank where, workers are probably working remote and completing centralized intake. And then once they determine whether or not someone is eligible or not, then they get referred to the local office for ongoing case management. And the introduction of a risk-based approach is dominant in this feature where, it's based on the questions that you ask on the online application or the telephone meeting that you have. And it's a really, I would say quick and dirty. And what ends up happening is when the file gets transferred to the local office, there's a bit of a quality check, and sometimes people are being found ineligible. There's a lot of capacity within the SAMS system, and this will age me, but to run tapes in the background with Canada Revenue Agency to determine whether or not there's any income. And we've always had access as workers to Canada Revenue Agency checks, credit checks. We often ask for bank statements. That's part of the system design. But what ends up happening now is that a lot of that stuff is happening in the background. And one of the fears that workers communicate to me as we talk about this automation and the risk-based measure is that workers are actually fearful of overpayments for recipients. And that's not because we don't want people who, took the step to reach out for social assistance because they need money, that they're getting something that they're not entitled to. Workers talk about how overpayments, especially if they're referred to a collection agency, can impact recipients' lives for 7 years. It can prevent housing applications from going through. It can impact future, credit applications. It is a real situation where workers understand that overpayments, besides the burden to pay it back, can actually impact someone's lives for a really long time. And the challenge with some...
Can you tell folks what an overpayment is? Because I don't know if everyone would know, and it sounds, it's not what you think it is. So I thought maybe you could just explain what it is, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so technically an overpayment is when you have received a benefit in which you are not entitled to under the legislation. So it could be an initial check that could include basic needs and shelter. It could be a one-time allowance in order to get over a hurdle. It could be like an emergency housing, rent, last month's rent. It's when the system determines that you have received something that you're not eligible for. And it could have been because you've had earnings that you didn't let us know because, that was last month, not this month. But we calculate things retroactively. We're a bit tricky that way. It could be because you didn't disclose that you are in receipt of income from something else. So an overpayment happens, and with this new automated system, the way in which grants happen, and then by the time you actually meet with a worker, it could be 30 days, it could be 60, it could be 90. So checks are going out the door, or direct bank deposit, or whatever method you receive them, and you may not have met the criteria, which is very rigid, and that results in an overpayment. So the risk-based approach and the screening and the granting that happens through the new automation is that it can impact eligibility, it can impact the future, but it can also be a situation where the really important questions aren't being asked to determine where someone is and why they're applying for assistance, because it's very mechanical. And that is a real issue when you're actually trying to support someone where they're being granted based on ticking boxes, rather than actually an interview or a conversation or relationship current circumstances are.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carrie Lynn, for giving us some insight into what's coming down the pipes. And maybe, ineligible can be a cautionary tale, but we don't know if it'll be used. But if you ever want someone at those tables, I'd be happy to join you. Amy, I'm wondering what your thoughts are based on some of what Carrie Lynn said and those challenges, the lack of flexibility in the system that already exists, and what's coming and sounds even a bit more intense in that regard. How are you thinking like low-income folks are going to be navigating that these new changes, and what are your concerns moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's scary. It's definitely scary. Things are tough as it is. I mean, it's already hard enough to try to get funding and to know what to ask for, because, you may not qualify for this, but there's other programs that may not be mentioned to you. Without that personalization, like Carrie Lynn mentioned, there's no back and forth interview. People's situations aren't always as black and white as, these criteria list would be. So I think the, not being able to have that discussion is going to turn a lot of people away. They're going to look at other means to try to get income if this seems too hard for them. And that, and when I say that, I don't mean like go out and get a job. I mean, possibly start selling drugs or stealing and selling things. It shouldn't be that difficult for people to get, the basic necessities that they need. And I think if we make it any harder, we're going to see depression within recipients, right? They're going to be scrambling to try to find money. They are not going to know where to turn. They're going to lose their housing. They could, I had it happen to me. I lost my job and I had daycare subsidy, and I couldn't find another job and I lost it. And at that point, that's when I had to go on OW because I couldn't afford to pay for daycare. People, and these are situations that happen all the time. Like, you want people to go out and get jobs, but there's no supports there. So if you're making it harder for them, it's just going to seem impossible. I mean, it's calculated, right? Like Carrie Lynn said, they're trying to make it harder so people just give up.
Thank you, Amy, for those insights. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on specifically how single moms are impacted by those challenges and the lack of flexibility and the lack of childcare, subsidized childcare, how long the waiting lists are, as well as, we know from the data, like, women sometimes will have to return to abusive situations as well in order to make ends meet if they're denied Ontario Works or they've been deemed ineligible. Do you have any other thoughts on how single moms are navigating that space?
Yeah, for sure. So like you said, a lot of women will do whatever it takes to care for their children. If they've left an abusive situation, ended up in a shelter, you can only stay there for so long. There are people there to help, but what do you do when you have to leave the shelter? Where are you going to go? Right? Not everybody has family members they can rely on. So next best thing, try to get back together with an ex. And if that person is an abusive ex, the whole system has failed that mother and that child. Again, with the childcare situation, my child's 16 now, so it's been a long time since I've needed childcare, but I don't know anybody who could afford to put their kids in childcare, even working minimum wage. It's, for me, when I lost my childcare subsidy, it made more sense for me to stay home. I lived in a housing unit. Made more sense for me to stay home on welfare and take care of my kid than it did to go out and work, because I wouldn't have made enough. I made more money on OW. And, just adding all these barriers in, it's cruel. It's just really cruel. I can't see how a single mom, even with one kid, having to go, here to get this information, there to get that information. Maybe they're receiving child support, and that could be, it used to be seen as income. So that could affect how much they're getting. Well, are they getting extra child tax? Maybe they have a child with a disability, so their child tax is a little bit higher. These are things that need to be discussed. You can't just assume that, that income, I'll say, is actual income, because it isn't always. Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Amy. That's incredibly insightful for folks who might not know what that process might be like. Carrie Lynn, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just think it's so important. So I am the treasurer of the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare. I don't have kids. I'm not actually a huge fan of kids. But the reason why I'm passionate about childcare is specifically because of what I observed with a woman's life being able to shift when she was able to access subsidized childcare. Mm-hmm. So from a women's economic justice perspective, from a life-changing moment of a breath of hope in a dire situation, access to affordable, high-quality childcare is a game changer. And, while I do represent childcare workers who are amazing humans, who are underpaid and underappreciated, and this government does not do near enough for a quality childcare system, my passion for childcare is rooted in when I was actually able to support single moms and to move forward with subsidized childcare, and how that was, their shoulders dropped an inch. There were other pivotal moments, but childcare and access to subsidized housing were two moments where you could see transformation begin in getting out of, the horrible circumstances that they were in. So it's work that I continue to do because it is so important for us to do better.
Absolutely. And you both bring up critical points that came up in the interviews with caseworkers and single moms and the advocates, right? The anti-poverty activists. Like, these systems are interconnected, and there's issues across all of them. And there are also surveillance and data gathering processes across all of these systems also, and they all share information. So when we think about the breadth of information being collected about low income folks, specifically single moms, and that kind of invasive quality of that aspect of it is really something to consider. And just that these, changes in these areas like childcare and affordable housing can have profound impacts on folks and actually help alleviate poverty and get them into a way better living situation, and be able to then work on the other aspects of their life. Folks have a right to housing. That's why we have a national housing strategy, right? So I think you brought up some critical points here, and I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I feel like an hour is definitely not enough time for us, is it? We could just do this. We could chat about this all night. But I know we have limited time, and we want to leave some time for questions as well at the end. So let's shift to talking about anti-poverty organizing, because we've all been involved in different ways and different aspects over the years, and even together organizing against the cuts to the community startup and maintenance benefit, which I talk about in chapter 6. So the conclusion of the book really highlights and speaks to the counter narratives of resistance. And I saw this with anti-poverty activists I interviewed, obviously, but a lot of the single mothers I interviewed as well. Like they might be micro everyday acts of resistance, or a lot of them were actually involved in anti-poverty organizing and struggle. And a lot of folks don't really know that. I mean, it's not safe for everyone to organize in a big public way. And Amy, I really want to turn to you to ask you about that, what that's like, why there's fear around speaking out, particularly in a system that is so heavily surveillance based and regulatory, how that impacts people's capacity to participate. So we have about 10 minutes before we open it up for questions to talk about this. And I also wanted to note, as well as Caseworkers, the chapter I have in the conclusion, and the caseworker chapter as well, like they also found different ways to participate and support recipients who were, fighting to raise the rates. Some of them would wear buttons or show up to rallies, or like Carrie Lynn actually organized alongside and with anti-poverty groups that do direct action. So we saw there's a breadth of resistance and pushback in a variety of ways, and there's a diversity of tactics happening. So I thought to start things off, I'm wondering what we've learned from our anti-poverty organizing over the years. And Amy, maybe you'd like to kick off that conversation for us.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So I was one of those people who was like, nope, I'm not doing it. I'm not going. I'm not getting involved. A friend at the time was really pushing me to do it. And I showed up to the Kingston Coalition Against Poverty event, or a meeting, sorry. And I don't know what came over me. I was just like, all right, let's do this. I think my biggest thing that I did in all my years would be what we called Party in the Park. And what we did was organized a big party basically on Canada Day, where the goal was to have people in the north end of Kingston, which would be our, ghetto area. I don't like using that word, but that's kind of what it's been turned into. They would have celebrations downtown Kingston, but it was just impossible for some of these people to get to. So my goal with that was to, number one, include, people in the north end to have a celebration, but we also did a lot of education at this event. So we had flyers done up, we had other organizations who came. And to me, this was a non-threatening way to get people out, allow them to have their kids with them, and really show them, the power that they had. Here are meetings you can come to. Here are funds you can access through OW. If you need help with that, call us. That was really one of, I think, my greatest events that I ever did. The people in the community absolutely loved it. We had all kinds of people show up after. They would be calling us, looking for ways to kind of help them navigate things with CAS and housing and different things like that. I think the biggest scare for most people, especially single moms, is their children, right? What happens if I go to a rally and police show up and I don't pick my kid up off the bus at the end of the day? What's going to end up happening? The school's going to call. Then CAS gets called. And then there goes the whole, snowball effect. Then all of a sudden you're seen as a bad mom. And then you have CAS at your door all the time, and they're showing up, and the school's watching you, and everybody's watching you. There's also the fear that, what if I speak out? What if I end up on camera? I mean, news stations show up when there's events and different things. If I show up on camera, my worker sees that I'm there. Am I going to get in trouble? Are they going to am I going to lose my benefits? It's really, really, really scary to think that your income, everything you rely on, can be taken away so quickly. But you have this need to want to fix it because you need more, you want more. It's so frustrating, and you can see it in people's faces how badly they want to fix this, but they're just so damn scared because it would ruin everything. Because, as we've said, everything is in the back office. It's all connected. So if you lose OW, are you going to ever be able to apply again? Will you get that overpayment that Carrie Lynn talked about? Will you then lose your access to the food bank because of that? Well, then will you lose your subsidy for daycare? It's just, there's so many different scenarios that run through your head that just terrify you. I love that Carrie Lynn especially has organized so many workers. It's refreshing to see, right? It really helps people to see, okay, not, all these workers aren't all evil. They really do want to help us. I think it's so important, though. We need to focus on some way to get more people out to speak, even if it's not in a public venue, at least, like Chris did here with interviewing single moms and really understanding the fear and, just the daily struggle they have. Their voices are definitely the most important. We should not be relying on policymakers who have never struggled before. They do not know how to help poor women dealing with domestic violence. We need more people on the ground like Chris, Carrie Lynn, actually doing the talking to poor people and making sure that everything that's being done is being done in a way that's going to support them.
Thank you, Amy, for that. I remember partying in the park. I definitely partied in the park that night. It was awesome. And I appreciated all the hard work you put into organizing that. And I also really appreciated your comments on working with caseworkers. And I think it's like, we don't expect that. And I think that's really interesting. And I'd love, Carrie Lynn, for you to share. I know you've shared with me and Amy, just in terms of like that relationship building and this bond that the two of you have even 10 years later. Like what did you see? What kind of interesting and creative and powerful things did you see when caseworkers and recipients came together and activists on these issues?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, it's not just Carrie Lynn, it's the Canadian Union of Public Employees Ontario who passed a motion on convention that the Raise the Rates campaign and working with anti-poverty groups, including direct action poverty groups, was a priority. And that resolution was passed 10 years ago, and that opened up an entire conversation about how do we engage frontline workers in anti-poverty work. And that is a huge challenge because even as someone who was not working frontline at the time, I had just embarked on, doing full-time campaign work for QP Ontario. When you're the worker in the room, it is not a friendly room. And there are really difficult conversations that need to happen to build trust and to, identify the fact that we have some real common goals and we can figure out how we can use our political pressure points in having different intersections to actually apply pressure. And, there were many times, because I had the opportunity to travel the province and work with a bunch of different groups, where you literally are just overwhelmed with the intensity in the room of the anger and the resentment of the role that we play in the system. And that takes really thick skin to be able to take it, process it, unpack it, acknowledge the privilege that we have, and to figure out how to move forward collectively. So it's not easy, but there are magical moments that end up happening. Especially, I was quite fortunate because I had a budget to work with to be able to support the good work that was happening on the ground. And it's one of the biggest struggles of anti-poverty organizing when it comes to the fear to engage and to do the grassroots work and to organize people for their power. But the fatigue that can set in when you're actually struggling to survive each and every day and then trying to take on an activism role as well. And I reflect on that because that's where, QP was able to step in, where you need money for a barbecue, Amy, for the party in the park. No problem. I can get that for you. We need to rent barbecues. Okay. I can take care of the logistics for that because no one has a credit card in the organizing group, but I do, and I can take care of that. You want flyers printed? No problem. How many? Do you want them translated? Let's do it. And that showing up, not just financially, but showing up with the people power to actually make the rising and the uprising and the agitation happen is something that I was happy to contribute with. And then when it's the casework that happens, like Amy was talking about how we were trying to provide people support who had questions. Well, who better to provide advice about casework than the actual frontline workers? Like, oh, they're not going to give you this, but you should ask for this. And that's because we're trained to have significant knowledge and we know how to navigate the system. And by showing up in that way, that's how we build relationships. So you want the media there? No problem. Let me get a press release out. Let me get communications to make some phone calls for you. Let's line up some speakers. Let's have some coaching for the speakers. These are all resources that the labor movement can show up with, and that frontline workers are part of the labor movement. And it's just about getting over that hurdle of difficult conversations and recognition of a significant power dynamic.
Thank you, Carrie Lynn, for that. I remember being in a room in Kingston with you, definitely taking a lot of heat from the low-income folks in the room, and really having that reflexivity and understanding that the reason folks are angry is because often caseworkers are their only point of entry in the system, right? They're the only folks that they get to interact with. They don't know what happens behind the scenes with policy or the technologies, right? So it's their only way to intervene is through their worker. Sorry, our alarm is going off here. Still going off. Stop. Okay. So sorry, it's still going. Okay, good. Yeah, sorry, that was very distracting. And just in terms of I really appreciated what you said and how Amy framed it as well. Low income folks are the experts on poverty. They're the ones living it, and they should be leading what resistance looks like. Let's be allies and get behind their work, whether we're scholars, whether we're union, whether we're labor or other advocates from other social justice groups. So I think really taking the lead from folks who are experiencing it as their expertise, but also relying on the expertise of folks working frontline. Yeah, the tricks of how to get around some of these issues. So, and I heard that from caseworkers I interviewed as well, is we will sometimes either turn a blind eye and pretend we didn't hear something, or we gently suggest an avenue to explore without kind of outright coming out and saying what they should be doing, because they could get in trouble for what they're telling the recipient to do. So I think there's so many different layers of how folks push back. And I appreciate how you both kind of pulled together those themes of coming together in different ways and what that looks like. And just, remembering the amazing work we did in Kingston together. And it's a great way to end our formal part of this presentation. And I know we've gone over a couple minutes, but let's open it up to some questions if there are any. I'll do my best to facilitate. Oyenda, I don't know. I don't see any text messages from you. Maybe folks are quiet. We can keep chatting too if that's something that folks want to do. I'm easy.
I have a question here from someone. It might be a good one for Carrie Lynn. So there's a question from Melissa, and it's, do overpayments go to collection agencies?
There are some municipalities that manage the overpayments in-house. And then there are some municipalities who have contracted that work out to collection agencies. And overpayments are portable. So if you incurred an overpayment in Kingston, and then let's say you decide to move to Peterborough because the housing's more affordable, that overpayment will follow you to Peterborough. If you exit assistance, then it will be up to wherever you exited assistance to determine how they're going to collect it. So if Peterborough still has it in-house, then there would be an overpayment recovery unit who would negotiate a repayment plan. If Peterborough, for example, has contracted that work out, then it could be going to a collection agency. But even while you're on assistance, you're still going to be paying back a portion of your check every month to start to wear it down. So then you're even having less to collect or to receive for food and shelter, because the overpayment deduction comes off of that as well.
So I have another question here that would be a good one for you, Carrie Lynn. So it's from Jade. And Jade would like to know, how has COVID impacted access to welfare?
So COVID accelerated the transformation of centralized intake, and there's also a centralized benefits unit for ODSP right now. So it accelerated the government's timeline for the implementation of what they call prototypes. Obviously COVID has resulted in many workers working from home, which means the point of entry for recipients to get in touch with their worker, even though there could be challenges to access through technology, is either phone or email. And then the government has just also introduced a new chat feature. And I always think about this, there are times where text works or chat. There are times when an email works. But there are times when even, me trying to be specific about what kind of breadcrumbs I need from the grocery store when my husband's there picking them up, that things get lost in translation when it's literally texting back and forth. We've all been there. And I really worry about that. And I worry that often when people ask for something once, if they don't get the response that they had hoped for, they don't ask again. And I worry about the chat feature, and I worry about the technology and the lack of, there's an energy that also happens in a room when you're with people. Of course, COVID and safety protocols are very important for us to make sure that people are safe. But it has been a springboard for the government to implement things more. And I think the lens of not talking about the relationship is not necessarily at the forefront. And as things start to transition to life stabilization work, that is going to be based on relationships and going to be based on asking those difficult questions where conversations actually start to identify where work or where people want to self-direct the work that they want to undertake to actually, move forward in different parts of their life. So that's kind of like the COVID Cole's notes. But I think that some of these pieces are really challenging, especially if it's one of the only ways that people can access their workers.
Great. Thanks for that answer. I also got texted a question as well. Amy, I love that they were going to you. That's fantastic. I can take some of the pressure off me. And I know we only have a couple minutes. So the question is from Melissa, where do panel members see the anti-poverty movement going in Ontario presently? And maybe let's start with Amy, since Carrie Lynn just finished up. And just be mindful, we have 3 minutes and we should probably say goodbye at the end. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I've kind of been out of the activist scene for a little bit now. It was, as we talked about, it gets exhausting, right? Still living in poverty and trying to be an activist, it can be really tiring. So I've taken a bit of a break. I am seeing, from what I've seen, a lot of labor people have really been stepping forward. I know they've always been around, but I see them stepping forward a lot more, especially here locally. I don't know how it's going to look, to be honest, with COVID right now. I mean, it's difficult. We can't get together in crowds like we used to, and we can't show up, at the premier's office with tens of thousands of people like we used to. I think what, along with everything else, I think it's going to have to evolve in a different way to keep everyone safe. And I'm actually interested, to see how that will move forward. I know we have things like, online petitions and things like that. And I still think those are really great to keep going with. But yeah, I think we definitely have to find a way to make noise on a safer level, likely online.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. Carrie Lynn, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly, I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and I think that COVID does present challenges, but I will say that tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, I have a conference call booked with the OCAP, Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, organizers to talk about the reimagining what the Raise the Rates campaign looks like province-wide as we move through COVID. And I think that that's exciting work. And I think this political moment that we're in of a provincial election coming, as well as the introduction of some technology that's pretty scary to recipients, that it's an opportunity to reinvigorate the movement and to fight back.
Awesome. That's great to hear that there's some new energy going into that work. It's been ongoing for many years, but yeah, definitely has ebbed and flowed. We did get one more question. Do folks feel, the panelists, do you have a few more minutes to hang out? And okay, so for folks who do have to sign off now, thank you for joining us, but we're going to keep chatting for a little bit longer. And so I have a question here from Jade. That is, what about people who don't have access to internet to access chat functions? How are you ensuring that these people don't fall through the cracks by moving to a digital platform? That's a great question, Jade, and it is a question I raise in the book, as well as I was seeing that some of these new online platforms were moving through the system, and there's now an online portal that folks can log into. And some of my questions in the book were, well, what is being tracked in that system too? And like, how is that data being managed? How is people's privacy being managed with that context? But I think Carrie Lynn might have some more insights, seeing as you're sitting at those tables right now.
Yeah, there's certain, so first of all, not a worker anymore and not a government decision maker, but do, as a representative of the union, have seats at tables to try to bring forward, these are some of the challenges that we think we can identify as frontline workers in the path that you're going down. And that is, so the government does a lot of surveying now of recipients to gauge what sort of technology they could implement. And they provide us with all kinds of stats. But there is concretely, a percentage of recipients who do not have access to technology, let alone the credit to get a cell phone, let alone a pay-as-you-go cell phone, let alone it's just the reality. So what is always put forward as a resolution to this is that what we'll do is, in the office, we're going to have some computer terminals for people to be able to log into, or they can go to the public library, which may have made a smidgen of sense, not in my books, but to others, pre-COVID.
Yeah.
And what we've seen is some of those spaces are unsafe due to immunocompromised people. Some people have other, challenges with going into these environments, let alone if they're in the office. Why can't they talk to a live body rather than be directed to a computer terminal? So, there are significant challenges with access to technology. That there's an app for that does not make sense for an entire population, including those in deep poverty, which is why I kind of, I observe some of the work that other organizations do when it comes to free internet for all. These are really important things, but it's not a solution in order to get service. And I still think about how much gets lost in translation in these chat functions. And from a surveillance perspective, I would just say this. I don't know for sure, but I know that it was my responsibility to document every interaction that I had with a recipient. Note-taking was important. The fact that someone called, the fact that I returned their call, what we talked about, what the request was, what my decision was, what the action item was, what the next step was. It was my responsibility to do that. So if I was a worker who was going through a chat portal in order to be able to receive something, I would make the choice not to copy and paste that into a note, and instead I would summarize it based on my perspective of the conversation. But I'm sure any provincially developed tool, there's got to be a tape somewhere that's just, keeping track of things. First of all, they want that. They want the metrics. How many people are using it? What is it being used for? What kind of benefits are being requested? And data is really important as they make all of these prototypes, and advance them. Mm-hmm. So there's always been documentation. That is the reality. Used to be long form notes. But now the automation introduces a whole new perspective, and workers' judgment is going to be really, really important.
Thanks for that answer, Carrie Lynn. Amy, really quick before or maybe just some final thoughts before we close up?
Yeah, sure. About the question or just thoughts in general?
Just whatever you want to speak to. No rules.
Again, I just want to thank you for this book. It really was an amazing read, and anybody who hasn't got their hands on it, please do. I love Margaret Little's quote on there. It's true. If you care at all about the poor, you need to read this book. I just want to say that we really need to keep supporting women that are sometimes forced to be living on social assistance. It's not most women's first choice. We don't get excited about having to go down to the welfare office and ask for money. We don't have more children to get a higher baby bonus. These are not things that make us proud. It really is an issue. We have to, really start separating these agencies as well. It just becomes almost impossible for women to navigate it all and be good moms and be good neighbors. We have a lot of work to do under this conservative government. I don't know what the next election is going to look like. That worries me all the time. Every time there's a new election, I think right now COVID kind of helped a little bit because it kind of kept the conservatives off of destroying it even more. So, I don't know what's going to happen when things start to slow down, but for everyone who showed up today to watch this, thank you, because that is a big step. If you learned one thing from any of us, that's the most important part. So, keep finding organizations in your area if you want to help continue to support any initiatives, whether it be anti-racism, anti-poverty. There's so many groups out there that, people are tired. They welcome the support. So please come in, especially if you're a poor person and you have things you want to say about it. Your voices need to be heard. And thank you again. Carrie Lynn, it was so wonderful to work with you again. You as well, Chris. I just adore you both so much. And this was just such an honor. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I feel like that's a great way to end our time together, because I know we've gone over a little bit, but I want to thank you both for your time and your dedication and your hard work that you continue to do in the capacity that you can. And we need to take breaks sometimes. Amy, I'm with you, not doing a lot of direct action organizing right now. My body can't do it. So I feel you. But yeah, thank you to everyone who showed up and everyone who's going to watch this after too, because I know some folks are going to want to watch the recording. So thank you for your time. And Oyinda, I don't know if you want to close out or if you just want us to end things like this, or I'm not sure what the next steps are. So I don't see a text from you or anything. I'm not sure what to do. I can end it. I have all the power. All right. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evening. Thank you, Amy, Carolyn, and Oyinda. And I really look forward to the conversations that come from this. And hopefully this is just the beginning and the start of, reinvigorating some amazing anti-poverty organizing in Ontario. Thanks, everyone. Bye.